We'll now have the convocation address by the chief guest.
Good afternoon. At the very outset, let me express my deep gratitude to the President of the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, Honorable Shri Shaktikant Das, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, for this privilege and opportunity for me to speak at the 18th Convocation Address. I'm equally grateful to Dr. Basant Pradhan, Director and Vice Chancellor, for enabling me to revisit this leading center of academic research and excellence. I compliment the Dean of Academic Affairs, Dr. Sirijit Mishra, the Registrar, Dr. Jai Mohan Pandit, the faculty members, and the students who have received the degree today. I have come to this institution earlier. Over the years, it has continued to remain an important and relevant center of research institution in India. Let me convey, therefore, my warmest appreciation and the hope that it would continue to be a distinguished center with high academic track record. I've been asked today to speak on the broad subject of reforming multilateral development banks and the 21st century agenda. What is multilateralism? The most common definition of multilateralism is where three or more actors are engaged in voluntary and institutionalized cooperation governed by norms and regulations with rules which equally apply to all. In this philosophy is embedded in the United Nations model of universal membership, which is fundamental to multilateralism. It is also embedded in the belief that multilateral institutions are better equipped to enhance cooperation for economic growth and productivity by garnering investments, both public and private. Nevertheless, given the somewhat fractured geopolitics, the global multilateral system of governance is encountering renewed challenges. In the oldest arrangement, it was unilateralism, as we all know, which was then somewhat extended to bilateralism, then to regionalism, particularly preferential agreements among a subset of nations, and finally, of course, multilateralism. The question which is relevant today is whether plurilateralism is the next stage of evolution for the arrangements of international cooperation. Plurilateralism is premised to bring like-minded partnership in many sectors as possible without being at the mercy or being the first to be admitted as new members in the earlier organization. Experience tells us that in any holistic classification between different forms of cooperative arrangements would be bereft of reality and indeed could be counterproductive. Plurilateral arrangements can coexist with other forms of cooperation like regional, bilateral, and of course multilateral. Therefore, multilateralism would be a spectrum in which different forms of cooperative framework and different kinds of arrangements can coexist depending on the preference of the stakeholders. Coming back to the broad theme of multilateral development banks, we are aware that at the end of the Second World War, delegates of 44 countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, for the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference in 1944 to come to a series of rules and regulations on international cooperation. These led to the emergence of rule-based international economic architecture. The above conference resulted in the formation of two institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD. The IMF was charged principally with the responsibility of maintenance of fixed exchange rates centered around US dollar and gold. According to Article 1 of the IMF, Articles of Agreement, the purpose is to promote international monetary cooperation, facilitate expansion and balanced growth of international trade, promote exchange stability, assist in the establishment of a multilateral system of payments, give confidence to members, and to shorten the duration and lessen the degree of disequilibrium in international balance of payments. Primary article, therefore, of the International Monetary Fund. The IBRD, now known as the World Bank Group, was responsible for providing financial assistance for reconstruction after the Second World War for economic development of the less developed countries. In the final act of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference in 1944, it was agreed that the bank would assist capital through normal channels at reasonable rates of interest for long periods for projects to raise the productivity of the borrowing country. And this article was crafted based on an agreement that the bank should guarantee loans made by others. As of date, the World Bank Group comprises the following organizations: the IBRD, which lends to low and middle income countries; IDA, that lends to low income countries; IFC, which lends to private sector; and MIGA, which encourages private companies to invest in foreign companies. While the World Bank Group is the oldest and the largest multilateral bank, over the years, several other MDBs and regional development banks have emerged. Today, surprisingly, there are as many as 15 to 16 prominent MDBs and RDBs existing in one common spectrum. The original mission of the World Bank represented the twin objectives of ending extreme poverty by 2030 and promoting shared prosperity by boosting the income of the poorest 40 countries in each country. However, the World Bank and the world today is beset with a multiplicity of problems. First and foremost, the persistence of extreme poverty, with 23 countries in Africa not even reaching the minimum 2.15 per day, a far cry from $6.85. Far from shared prosperity, income divides in the region and within the country have increased. Similar, the debt situation is serious. The public external debt of emerging markets and developing countries is large and it is rising. Nearly 1/5 is from the MDBs. Developing countries' external debt, for instance, increased by over 175% between 2008 to 3.9 trillion in 2021. A sizable proportion of the debt, 57, is from private bondholders and creditors, followed by MDBs owning 21% of the debt, Paris Club 6%, and China 4%. Since 2020, the world has witnessed declines in growth, increases in poverty, and reversal in human development. The number of people in extreme poverty increased for the first time in decades by 11%, and more than 3 billion people still live below the $6.85 a day. Shared prosperity shows similar trends as measured by the prosperity gap. About 349 million people across 79 countries are experiencing food insecurity. There is need to prioritize challenges related to global public goods such as climate action, energy transition, future pandemics that impinge on growth and development. Many countries are off track on sustainable development goals. Countries need financing to achieve sustainable development goals and combat transboundary challenges. These are not mutually exclusive goals, and the MDBs in the current state cannot meet these huge demands on their finances. Prioritizing global public goods will need huge additional financing, both from public and private sector. There is need for creating an incentive structure and would bring about changes in the current operating procedures and models of the multilateral development banks. International development finance, IDA, remains still short of the targets necessary to meet IDA obligations. It is obvious that all development partners need to ramp up and deploy additional finance, enable blending finances with private capital, and secure greater levels of concessionality to incentivize work on global challenges without crowding out other development priorities which remain there. So the question really is, are the multilateral institutions equipped to take on these new challenges? It is widely believed that the current global financial order is no longer fit for the purposes of dealing with the unprecedented and multilateral challenges facing the global community. To make a meaningful dent on poverty, achieve shared prosperity, and fund global public goods, the MDBs must be relevant to growth and development needs of all developing countries, including middle-income countries. There is need for expansion of the mandate of the MDBs in the context of new trans-boundary challenges, matching the ability of MDBs to finance these larger goals without reducing development financing. Given the high levels of financing needs of both low-income and middle-income countries, and the increased debt vulnerabilities induced by COVID-19 health crisis, a holistic approach for reforming the multilateral development banks by the international community is necessary. Several important systemic issues need to be addressed. How can the incentive structure of the MDBs be strengthened for provision of greater global public goods? How can the operating model of the multilateral development banks be strengthened that it holds on to the MDBs accountable for the results, particularly for the global public goods? How much funding is needed? Emerging markets and developing countries other than China will need to spend around $1 trillion per annum by 2025 and $2.4 trillion per year by 2030 on the basis of the analysis made by the World Bank very recently in the report submitted to the spring meeting of IMF and World Bank. In terms of external finance, therefore, there is need for a breakthrough to mobilize $1 trillion per year to external finance, which will be needed by 2030 for emerging markets. The World Bank Group also estimates that the total average annual public and private spending needs to address the global challenges of climate change, conflict, pandemics, and these would be in the tune of $2.4 trillion for developing countries between 2023 and 2030. This, of course, embeds in it the need for global public goods. Should the twin objectives be broadened enough, namely the twin objectives of ending extreme poverty and the objective of shared prosperity, be broadened to include the new challenges of global warming and climate change? The recent meeting in Washington sought to do this by somewhat redefining the purpose. On 30th March 2023, it sought to somewhat recalibrate and redefine through the Development Committee on the new purposes intended. So the 21st century challenges on resources, operating models, governance structure, and the mission must include trans-boundary challenges. Over the years, various G20 presidencies have sought to address the reform of the multilateral financial system. For instance, the German presidency in 2013, the Italian presidency in 2021, resulting in the outcome of the Bali Declaration. Against this backdrop, the G20 under the Indian presidency has set up an independent expert group, which I am co-chairing along with Lawrence Summers for the purposes of this being called the Independent Expert Group. A roadmap for an updated MDB ecosystem for 21st century, touching upon various aspects of the MDB evolution, and an evaluation of the various estimates regarding the scale of funding required from the MDBs are part of the terms of reference, apart from seeking mechanisms for a better coordination among the multilateral development banks itself, whose number, as I told you, are close to now between 14 to 16. For fulfilling this purpose, this independent expert group needs to address some of the following issues. Can the lending capability of the MDB system be extended? How can one balance the new challenges with the optimization of the MDB's balance sheet? What can be done to mobilize much greater private capital flows? And how can the MDB system be reformed? These are complex questions. The multilateral development banks are infervent. We must recognize that each multilateral development bank have their own shareholding and their own governance structure. Therefore, while it is important to lay down a coherent set of rules and regulations on important functions, we need to tread carefully to ensure that autonomy is not significantly impinged. And yet institutional arrangements would need to be put in place which would entail a coherence in the functioning of these multilateral institutions to optimize their inherent lending capability and, more important, to contribute to global good and, broadly speaking, address three important functions: incentivizing private capital, de-risking investments, providing greater concessional finance. In all this, of course, technology that is provided by the multilateral institutions can be used to support developing countries, to help them strengthen the economic management and reduce poverty. What do I expect to come out of this expert committee? This is not a research committee. I can assure some skeptics, we intend to come out with a set of recommendations which are tangible and which can make a decisive difference. We certainly intend to give suggestions on the optimization of the balance sheet strength of the World Bank. We certainly intend to be cognizant of the huge leveraging capability of multilateral institutions. For example, the World Bank, the amount of capitalization so far is a very small amount of $20 billion, against which it has already lent over $800 billion. To increase the lending capability, the need for recapitalization in some form or the other is now an inescapable necessity. It is curious that the IBRD as an institution does not have any built-in replenishment cycle. This deserves serious consideration. Similarly, other multilateral institutions who have effectively leveraged their modest capital also need to enhance their ability to recapitalization. We are therefore examining how, given this ability of theirs, the lending capability can be substantially enhanced to meet the challenges that lie ahead and the challenge of global public goods, the original mission, along with eliminating poverty and shared prosperity. It is imperative to leverage clearly more of the MDB's inherent resources to optimize their balance sheets for higher lending. The present structure allows us to look at various methods and options for doing so. For example, evaluating through simulations that what can optimize MDB's leveraging capability with marginally higher levels of risk. The MDB financing targets set by different committees will require mobilization of private capital. However, for that, this committee has to evaluate the implications that it might have on its operating models. And operating models not only for the IBRD, but for other multilateral development banks. Broad and deep changes are necessary and will require significantly strengthened performance, such as, for instance, on the whole idea of mobilizing private capitals, on the issue, for instance, of various forms in which risk mitigation can assist in garnering greater private capital. Risk mitigation, for instance, illustratively, on guarantees of various kinds, realistic rates of return, and risk management in the whole spectrum of possibilities. At the same time, funding perhaps a way in which the compelling needs of global public goods, transboundary challenges, and the vulnerabilities arising from climate change can be suitably and credibly financed. We want to make sure that the emerging transboundary challenges of global public goods do not come at the expense of resources available to address the original twin objectives, which is to end extreme poverty and enhance shared prosperity. The world is fervent. We need to be innovative. We need to ensure that the multilateral development banks rise up to the old challenges and the new challenges to make them contemporary and relevant to the 21st century. It is said that the world must learn to work together, or finally it will not work at all. Trust, coherence, congruency, and audacity would be the hallmark of these transformative changes. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you.